There's a reason for differing disciplines. There's a reason why when we go to school, we don't just learn science, because there are other kinds of questions, other queries that are being asked by us humans, and other methods that are needed in order to adjudicate the proper discernment in those fields.
Welcome to the Explorations Podcast, interdisciplinary discussions that unravel the secrets to a life well lived. I'm your host, Luis Hernandez, and I'm joined by my two great friends, Edwin and Joe. Guys, how are you guys doing today?
Feeling great. Excellent. Loving your background, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. We're talking about science. So, I'm thinking about the stars and the galaxies and stuff. Today, as I just said, we are talking about science from a big picture perspective. We're going to take a deep dive into not only the definition of science, but some of our personal history with science and take a look at this really important subject in the perspective of philosophy and the connection to philosophy. So to begin this conversation, I wanted to start with just the term science. It apparently came from the Latin scientia, which means knowledge. And this term kind of talks about the pursuit of knowledge. And when I heard that definition, I immediately thought about our conversation about philosophy, which can be defined as the love of knowledge, right? Or love of wisdom.
Love of wisdom, yeah.
Love of wisdom. So I wanted to start a conversation there of like, okay, wait, how can we differentiate between science and philosophy? What's the relationship there? Because to me, they sound like very, very similar terms. And yet in academia and in life, they're very, very different.
Yeah.
Joe, I'll ask you this question first. How can we define science and how do we look at science through the perspective and the eyes of philosophy?
It's a great question, Louis. Etymologically, like you just shared, science itself, scientia, which in its Latin derivative also has its connection in the Greek episteme, which is knowledge, where we get the word epistemology, the study of knowledge, questions about how is it that we know what we know, is really a great place to start. But when we think of science today, it has been, in a certain sense, co-opted by a shift in the definition, going back 450 years, speaking of a particular method, a particular orientation, a certain habit of the mind, which is distinct from this sort of general assessment of knowledge as such. But to your question concerning the distinction between science and philosophy, as you've noted, philosophia, the love of wisdom, while wisdom overlaps with knowledge, no doubt, there is nevertheless a distinction. So knowledge, one could simply define as the apprehension of what is, right? This sort of awareness of what is. That's a definition of knowledge. Wisdom is the application of knowledge to one's life, right? Sort of an existential application. So wisdom is, in a certain sense, doing something with knowledge. And it's telling that philosophy is not really the love of knowledge, but the love of wisdom. There's an important shift there. So again, of course, philosophy has much to say about knowledge itself, but that distinction in orientation is an important one. But we could say more about that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, my follow-up question is, why is wisdom not like typically associated with the sciences in the sense that philosophy kind of seems to be? Science, especially in my personal experience, is more of a by rote type of experience where I'm like just learning facts and just kind of taking it that way. Does wisdom have a place in the sciences for someone who is not professionally in that field, just like the average Joe? What is wisdom's place within the sciences?
Absolutely. We would definitely want to have an invitation. We can think of wisdom here, in other words, as a certain disposition or a posture, again, a habit of the mind. And it would be helpful, I think, at this point in the conversation to offer a certain definition of science, moving out of it merely as equivocating with the word knowledge etymologically, and thinking of it in terms of its particular discipline, its field of discourse. Science can simply be defined, again, going back about 450 years or so, folks like Galileo, Rene Descartes, Sir Isaac Newton, others, Francis Bacon, very important in laying down the bedrock for the scientific method. Science is essentially then an attempt to offer a descriptive and explanatory framework for the empirical world. One of the operative phrases there is that word empirical, that which is, in other words, opened to the five senses. that which we can discern by way of sight and measurement and so on. And science in this way operates under a certain methodology, which all of us have been catechized into in school, right? You've taken science labs and it's like, okay, we got to follow the scientific method, hypothesis, right? All of these things. But that methodology is very important. And the ability to verify, falsifiability, experimentation, all of those things are ingredient to the field of science. So it is an attempt to offer a descriptive and explanatory framework of the observable universe, of the observable world. And when I say observable here, I mean the five senses. And of course, we can use varying instruments. Now, that being said, through scientific discourse and discovery, we will at times gain greater access to the empirical world, greater power. And as we often hear from the Spider-Man comics, with great power comes great responsibility. And that responsibility piece is where we need to think about it in context of wisdom. So in a certain sense, the output of science, we need to perhaps think about what are the repercussions, the ramifications of this in society for our individual life. That's where philosophy comes in. But philosophy actually is already a priori. That is to say, already before science even gets off the ground. How so? Science presumes a number of philosophical things, like the intelligibility of the world. That if we go out with our measurements and do certain particularly discrete observations on some said phenomenon, that we're going to discern certain patterns found within nature, and that those patterns are in fact intelligible, and that we can, through discerning of those patterns, can then go ahead by way of prediction and see whether or not we have the proper theory and right, all of these things here. But this begs the question, how is this possible? How is it that we, this particular bipedal species on a third rock from the closest sun, right, the star, that we have this access to peer into the very depths of empirical reality? Right? That we have this cognitive capacity to, as it were, transcend our immediate limits, and by way of this intelligible framework that's somehow already there in nature. This is already a philosophical question. And scientists move out into the world, maybe perhaps unbeknownst to them, that they're holding on to these philosophical assumptions, but they're going out doing their science with the presumption, right, with the assumption that they are in fact making authentic discoveries about said reality. That's one thing where philosophy is already sort of underpinning it. There's much more to say about that.
I have a question about, you describe science as a discipline. And in that pursuit of truth that you're describing, like, can you talk a little bit more about the role that discipline plays within the sciences, and not only for scientists or people who are actively pursuing science, but how does discipline within the sciences play a role for the average person just living in a world surrounded by science?
That's a very deep question, Edwin. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I'll just say this. There are a couple of things here. The word discipline itself, I think, invokes the sense of orderliness, right? And when I articulate science as an academic discipline, what I am in part saying here is that it possesses a certain methodology and framework that has a kind of boundary condition, and so operates within certain presumed rules and laws, right? There's a discipline in that sense. And so the discourse and the habits of thinking are shaped and informed by that discipline if we're going to do good science. How does that bleed into everyday life for the average citizen who may not know anything about science, let's say? Well, if I'm a student in university and I come in and I take a science class, indeed, one of the things that I'm being sort of baptized into is a habit of thinking, right? And this clearly has transferable skills into other things that we do in life. But also the discoveries we make in science can, without a doubt, cultivate a sense of wonder and awe and curiosity about the observable world, about the universe. This is a very important conversation, especially in the post-COVID world that we are in, because we hear in the rhetoric on television and on other media outlets that we ought to follow the science. And of course, this raises the question, well, what do we mean by that? And what is science? And so there is, among the general populace, I would say in the West, a kind of fetishizing of science. And there's a sort of epistemic superiority, right? That if science says something, oh, well, somehow that's true. And I see this even in my students, right? Like science, yeah, that's true. That's objectively true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or facts are some other terms. And so that already shows us, well, science already has a kind of intellectual capital ingredient in the minds of many people. And so therefore, if that's the case, it has such an influence on the way we think, we ought to then really think about, well, okay, well, what do we mean by this? And what is science? So those are some of the ways in which it sort of percolates in the general populace. Edwin, please jump on in, man. I know I've been talking my brain off here.
No, this is great. So I'm actually going to pass it right back to you after I make a sort of few observations in my own life around how science has been helpful, which is the difference between logic and science. Because the best way for me, at least, to understand science's role in our lives is to think about it, and Joe, you were saying this, it's as an approach to understanding or discovery, or even name of this podcast, explorations, right? As we try to understand a thing. There's really like three ways I can think of, right? Either you bump into a phenomenon and you just think randomly what is happening, or one of my favorite is heuristics, which is something that's more passed down, right? It's a learning by a little bit trial and error that is not physically observed, but passed down from generations. So I was sick the other day, and one of the first things I did was pile down a bunch of ginger, because my mother just told me, ginger is the way you go, right? Is that scientific? Yeah, right. It seems to have worked for a lot of people. It worked for me, right? And then you have science itself. So this is why I was thinking about the connection between science and logic and philosophy as a way of understanding, because logic in itself is a discipline that may precede science. So I boomerang back to you, Joe, on that one.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. What's helpful is thinking about it historically. So the contemporary sciences come out of philosophy, like so many of the academic disciplines. And before the term science was used, the phrase was natural philosophers or natural philosophy.
What time period was this in, Joe?
We could go back about 500 years. In fact, if you go to, I think it's Oxford University, their science department is titled, I don't know if it's Oxford or Cambridge, I believe it's Oxford, it's titled Natural Philosophy.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah. So the term comes out of that. And there are those who are arguing that we need to return to that term for certain reasons. So thinking about it historically, the proto-scientists go back 2005, 2006, 2,700 years ago within a Western context, particularly in the Mediterranean basin. So if you look at folks like Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, these are figures you wouldn't necessarily encounter in a science class, but in a sort of classical philosophy class or an ancient philosophy class, who are usually dubbed as pre-Socratic philosophers, which are a collection of thinkers who came before Socrates. And many of their questions were one in which they were engaged with an attempt to understand the empirical world. Now, how they did that, there are a number of principles they sought to use. There were certain philosophical assumptions behind their thinking. You see here, though, historically, how rigorous inquiry into the nature of reality created the sort of wellspring for later on scientific development. The grandfather of modern science, in a certain sense, is none other than Aristotle, who took this approach quite seriously. That is to say, to categorize what he was able to observe. And so many of the things that we hear in the biology class come all the way back to Aristotle, right? The kingdom and species and phylum, and right, those categories among similarities of morphology among differing species. That thinking goes all the way back to Aristotle. And so he wrote a book on physics, right? And of course, very different than contemporary physics. But notwithstanding, we see that here. So there is indeed, Edwin, a deep marriage between a certain kind of thinking, even a logic, and the bubbling up of science. As history progresses, we begin to see a dispersive fissure among these ways of thinking. And a lot of that can be traced back actually to the Middle Ages, but they really blossom in what is called the modern period, the 16th and 17th century of continental Europe. Again, thinkers like Galileo Galilei, Rene Descartes, Francis Bacon, and their orientation and how what they did really laid down some of the foundations for modern science to come about.
So as far as the history of modern science, it seems like there are limits on science as it is developing between Aristotle and today.
Yeah.
What are those limits? Because you've also talked about kind of this emphasis society kind of place on the sciences more so than other aspects of academia or just the world. And yet, historically, we see that science doesn't always have the answers for us when it comes to certain historical situations.
Mhm.
What are the limits of science? And is it possible to kind of use an illustration of that limit
Yeah.
historically within the sciences?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to try to give a few examples to concretize what I'm going to say.
Because I'm mainly thinking from the medical field,
Yeah.
like with some major, like previous pandemics, bubonic plague and stuff, there was a misunderstanding of the sciences, I think,
Mhm.
when it came to handling a catastrophe. Like, is it possible to look at it through that context or a similar one?
Yeah, I think it is. And one may argue whether or not is that a failure in science or is it a failure in the use of science or has science not yet progressed in that category? And so it still falls under the purview of science. Those are important questions as we investigate something like that. But to keep it as simple as possible, the limits of science are governed by its methodology, right? Its methodology. So again, if you go back to the scientific method, we can already see that the orientation of modern science is one that is towards the observable world, observable phenomenon, right? That is that which we can see, taste, touch, etc. And that tells us a lot already if we think about it,
Mhm.
because it means that science cannot, de facto, by definition, say anything concerning the truth value of Picasso's Starry Night as to why it is a form of this kind of art versus another, right? Or why it generates a certain kind of,
Van Gogh.
yeah.
You said Picasso.
Oh, I
As an
see.
artist, I had to correct you on
My
that
bad.
one.
Van Gogh, Van Gogh.
I had to. I would have got in trouble.
That's right. That's right. Right. So it tells us that science is not treading that field, right? Science is not going to be able to adjudicate concerning the question of whether or not there is a transcendent divine mind behind all things, right?
But isn't science trying to answer that somehow
Mhm.
in some way?
Edwin, go ahead. Jump on in, brother.
Yeah, and I like the use case of the pandemic. So Joe's point, science has very little to say about the socio-political forces of what happened during the pandemic, right? There's a lot that science could say about epidemiology, virology, and so on that says, okay, we know why things are happening. It starts to break down because you start to move into a different discipline where science has not been as useful, probably mostly because a lot of what our current understanding, and Joe makes a great point about, making sure we remove science from our application and our ability to have used it to up to this point, right? And up to this point, science is only very useful for, and I'm going to go a little bit into complexity here, for things that are complicated in that the dynamics are such that there's an equilibrium, right? It settles to a state, which is not what the world is, right? When things starts to get more complex, when you start to involve consciousness, for example, so like science tries to say something about consciousness, but we're talking about the limits of science right now, right? This is me trying to explain to you what a bacteria is, and we're cavemen, right? There's very little we can say about consciousness because of its limitations. Now, imagine that multiplied by the number of consciousness that exists on this planet, the interactions between those. These systems are not separate. They are interacting with each other. And in that, you have a limitation in science's ability to go past some of the disciplines like physics and chemistry that it's already have done a lot for, right? So I think that's the issue.
Yeah. And to your point, Lewis, and what you're sensing, like you're saying, well, isn't science attempting to adjudicate the question of God in certain ways and whatnot?
Mhm.
And without a doubt, we see that occurring in, let's say, the popular arena. But when that happens, if I see, let's say, classic Carl Sagan or more contemporary Dr. Michio Kaku in City College, theoretical physicist, or Richard Dawkins, right, an eminent evolutionary biologist, or we can list all these wonderful scientific popularizers and amazing scientific teachers. The problem we see often, however, is that they will begin to meander into fields and certain questions and begin to pronounce certain judgments in those fields that are distinct from the field of science, but they speak as if or with the authority of science. Why is that dangerous? Because when they're doing that, when said scientist is talking about something that transcends the very bounds of their methodology, they're no longer speaking as scientists. They're speaking now as an amateur philosopher or an amateur theologian or an amateur artist, or, you know what I mean? And unless people are trained to discern the shift in discourse and be able to say, oh, you're kind of now speaking on something that you're actually not even trained in. And there is a wisdom, however, in looking at the data of science and say, well, given the data of science, we can perhaps make certain inferences concerning other questions that are outside of the purview of science. That's okay. But when one is not cognizant that they're doing that, and in my experience, most scientists that are popularizers, they're just not. They're not even trained in thinking about it. So they just go into fields that are beyond their capacity, but they're speaking with that sort of authority, right? It's a scientist. And so people are like, oh, snap, science proves that God exists, or science proves that God doesn't exist. That's actually a category mistake. What do I mean by that? Well, it's like kind of saying my art history class, or what this artist is showing, they prove that the molecular structure of this compound is such. Well, how do they do it? Oh, they're also a scientist? No, they just spoke from the field of art, and right. He's like, no, that's a category mistake. And so a lot of that happens, and the confusion abounds in popular society because of that.
As far as like going back to the limits of science, we've talked extensively about technology. Is that like one of the biggest factors as far as limits when it comes to the sciences? Because I can't think of, I mean, aside from what we're talking about, it seems like tech is the thing that kind of holds a leash on science as far as what we can discover, what we're able to discover with the use of technology.
There is definitely a reciprocity between techne or technology and science in two ways. Our technological advancements are predicated upon our scientific advancements. We can only, in a certain sense, this is not always the case, because we can stumble upon new technological innovations without even being aware of how we did that. Some may say Chat GPT is an example of this, right?
Right.
But for the most part, right, we can't make a car unless we have an understanding of thermodynamics, right, and internal combustion for an engine, right? So science comes first, then technological innovations. But reciprocity, in as far as the technological innovations then feed back into our ability to make further discoveries in science. So there's this sort of beautiful cyclical or reciprocal.
Yeah.
Thank you. Reciprocal. Reciprocal. Guys, I didn't have enough of my, I may need another shot. Effect. Reciprocity.
Got it.
Yeah. But Edwin, I want to hear you, because I call Edwin the Iron Man, because he has a pulse on technological innovations, and he knows how to adapt to it well.
No, I think you captured it. The only thing I would add is this is an example of going from complex to complicated. So where science works and where technology is showing this, when things are repeatable, this is what I was going back to, complicated. You're able to reproduce, right? Something that's very, very important in science is your ability to reproduce a phenomenon. If you can't, then everything pretty much breaks down in terms of science's ability. So engineering and technology is sort of a pathway that can actually lead before science, to Joe's point. You can definitely invent certain things before understanding it. But your ability to actually create something and create it several times means that there's a science behind it. So eventually the science will catch up, and vice versa, where you understand the science, but the technology is not there. In terms of time travel, for example, right? There's a lot science has to say about our ability to traverse time that technology simply is not there, and so on. So this is where folks get very confused about engineering or technology versus science, and where some of the more traditional back and forth that goes between engineers and scientists exists because of that very close relationship, but in some ways separate discipline.
Can you continue to speak into like what can't science do?
Yeah.
Just kind of flipping it. What are some ways that we can look at science to see its limits? Can we talk some more about like, this is what science cannot do? Like, it cannot accomplish this.
My apologies for not giving some of those salient examples I wanted to earlier in order to clarify what I was going to say. This is what happens in a conversation.
Right.
I think what's helpful here is to think about school, think about college, for instance, or university, and recognize that there are differing colleges or differing departments predicated on the certain kinds of questions that are asked and are attempted to answer. So if I go to the English department where I can study literature, there's a reason why science is not there, right? Because science is not, in one sense, asking those kinds of questions. And neither can science, according to its own methodological framework, offer any answers to those questions. So if we're learning how to read Shakespearean sonnets, I'm going to require certain techniques like exegesis and hermeneutics. I need to do a little history to understand the context of why Shakespeare, what was motivating him, how to read this text. All of those things, all of those tools and methods we learn in literary theory, for example, is not something that's in science. Science is not going to ask those questions, and neither is it going to attempt to, it can't by its own methodology. And if a scientist comes into an English class and begins to pronounce, right, pontificate, whoa, I think this, that, and third, because I'm a scientist, again, there's a category mistake, right? Red flag, red flag. So what am I saying here? There's a reason for differing disciplines. There's a reason why when we go to school, we don't just learn science, because there are other kinds of questions, other queries that are being asked by us humans, and other methods that are needed in order to adjudicate the proper discernment in those fields. So that's helpful. So I think, again, the humanities, the social sciences, this, that, and the third, but even there, right? Social sciences, right? And sociology and psychology, they have historically a profound love affair with the methodologies of science, right? Think of Skinner and others, right? The behavioralists. They wanted to bring that methodology into the social sciences so it could be more scientific. And contemporary sociology has, in a certain way, while it honors that, but also pushes back against this idea of objectification and standing out, right? By way of certain philosophers like Foucault and Derrida and the deconstructionalists will say, yeah, that doesn't work anymore. That has its limits. So again, I think that's one way, Louis, to think about what science can or cannot do. And it's hard, I think, for us to discern that because science has such a social capital. I'll give you an example, another example, contemporary show, right? On Netflix, I watch once in a while that show Flash. Put on my W. Okay. And I like watching it partly because, and this is for me, the way I use media, it's really telling me a lot of where people are and their thinking, right? So the way science is invoked in the Flash, right? Again, there's this deep fetishizing, right? It's like, oh my gosh, science, like the key to answering all these things. And you see it clearly there. You see it also in a show like Star Trek that goes back to the 70s or even perhaps the 60s. I don't even know when the first show came out, where there's this sort of utopian perspective on what science can do. And there are some things that are true, and there are some things that are just flat out fictional. Now, I think at this point, it may be helpful for our viewers and our listeners to perhaps for Edwin and I to go into like our own history with science.
Right.
Because like, who are these guys? Who are these jamokes? What the hell are they talking about, bro? What's their background, right? Maybe we should do that. Edwin, what do you think, bro? We talk about
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more sort of character of the limitations of science, which is that when we speak of science, Joe, you were making this point earlier, and we probably need to stick to it. You have to think of science separately from the current sciences, right? So science may have a lot to say about God and about a millennia, right? Or may have a lot to say about consciousness and about a millennia. Science has nothing to say or very little to say about consciousness or God now, right? So the limitations of the current sciences and versus science as a discipline, something we have to be careful about. And one way you can do that is think through I like this concept of mathematical reality, right? If you think of reality versus science, right? Reality is reality. Science is a method of understanding that reality. The mathematics, like we were talking about technology and science, mathematics has a deep relationship with science in that as we start to discover new things using the scientific methodology, there's something inherently mathematical about that. And it tells us something about the current reality, right? So, there's an interesting question about whether or not we discovered mathematics or whether or not we're using mathematics to understand reality. And that in itself is venturing into what Joe's point about philosophy, right? So that's the limitation. That's the horse race that's going on, right? Reality is infinite, right? In this horse race, which means it exists. Philosophy is further ahead, and then science is right behind, or current sciences is right behind that. That's what makes this a difficult conversation to have, is because we're coming at it from various angles.
Right. I think now's a great time to go into your personal experience, Edwin. What is your relationship with the sciences? Talk a little bit about your academic background, but what you were just saying about kind of the understanding of reality. How did your particular pursuit of the sciences, how did that kind of shape your understanding of reality? Can you just kind of unpack that for us?
A lot of my understanding actually is interwoven with Joe's, because we grew up in the sciences together. What predates that is I've always been fascinated by the human body and the human mind. So I went into the sciences with that perspective. Something very interesting happened to me when I was in high school, which is that I started to take chemistry and physics separate from biology. My entry into science is through biology. So then as I started to understand physics and chemistry, I started to understand that I actually had a very superficial understanding of the sciences using biology. Not to undermine biology in any way, but physics gets us a lot closer to understanding reality.
Interesting.
So as I started to get into physics and chemistry, I remember I was part of this program where they would interview high schoolers. It's called Pathfinder, where they would interview high schoolers. And I was preparing my speech for that interview. And I'm sitting outside of this room, and I'm trying to figure out, what am I going to say? And as I'm thinking that, I'm looking at a leaf. And as I'm looking at this leaf, I'm like, wait a minute. The leaf is a leaf. And all I'm doing is looking at it from different angle. So then I started seeing in my mind's eye photosynthesis and what creates it, the chemistry of the fundamentals of photosynthesis, and then the atoms that creates that. And then I'm going back and forth trying to understand this one leaf and its ability to actually explain all the sciences. So I went in and pretty much told everyone that, and I didn't proceed. It's like, I think I was more a philosopher that day than I was a scientist. But it was obviously very profound time for me, a realization at the time that it all comes together. And we still fail to figure out how it comes together. So as I go into college, this is where I say we start to intersect, Joe and I, where my love of science and that invitation from that thought experiment that I had turned into a love for physics. And then I started from a very, very reductionist way to say, all right, I'll study physics, then I'll study chemistry, then I'll study biology. And what I later on figured out was that this is all one and the same, right? And trying to understand it. And by taking a very reductionist view of the sciences, I was actually limiting my understanding. I credit that to a lot of the conversations Joe and I would have, right? You remember quantum consciousness, Joe?
That's right. Roger Penrose. Roger Penrose, was that?
Wow.
That's right.
Roger
He's
Penrose.
still alive, man. He's still kicking.
Yeah.
Yeah, my entry into science goes back. I always had a love for science as a kid. And I really was sort of set ablaze with a love for science. However, through a conversation I had with my father, we were in Brighton Beach, New York. It was an evening time. The sun actually set, so it was at night. And we were looking at the stars. And he said, you know, son, some of the points of light that you see, the source from which that light is emanating from no longer exists. I was so taken aback by that. I was like, what? And he started to go into great distances, and that light has a definitive speed. Now, mind you, my father never went to college. He just had a really strong native intelligence, and he was very aware of a lot of things. I remember him dropping in miles per hour, the speed of light, roughly 186,000 miles per second. I remember him saying that. And all of this sort of conversation set me on track where I said, oh my goodness, I need to do this for like the rest of my life, like study these things. And again, I already had a love for science, but that was something that was a salient conversation. Fast forward into the University of Rochester, where I meet Edwin, and our conversation around that wonderful book. This is the first conversation we had, right, Edwin? The Quark and the Jaguar. Who was the author again? of that wonderful work.
Murray Gell-Mann.
Oh my gosh. Yes, yes. And just then pursuing science and doing my studies in astrophysics and many of Edwin's courses in my own, right? They overlap. So we were together. And I have the privilege of even working in the field as an undergraduate researcher for a couple of years with none other than the eminent Dr. Adam Frank. He's sometimes on CNN and stuff. We're friends to this day. So yeah, a great love for science going all the way back.
I couldn't help but to help push Joe towards that evolution from science to philosophy. It is the track that he took that I'm in my own journey towards that, but would love to hear that one, Joe.
Yeah, I recognized in my undergraduate career, I would say really starting in my sophomore year, my love affair with science was motivated by certain philosophical concerns, certain philosophical perspectives. I looked at science as a doorway to understanding reality as such. But I came to realize, well, science has its limits. This is something I was kind of wrestling with in my undergraduate, right? I'm kind of thinking about it. And I saw that philosophy was able to get around some of those limits by asking differing questions and using differing modes. Even though when I was doing that, I always had this sort of perspective that, yeah, but science is really giving us something that even philosophy cannot give, right? And so I sort of internally wrestling with that in my undergraduate years. But I ended up moving deeper into philosophy precisely because I recognized while here, we're getting to a kind of almost bedrock foundational questions. So Edwin used earlier, he brought up the relationship between science and mathematics. That's interesting, right? Because I can be a pure mathematician and never darken the doors of a scientific academy. I never need science to do pure math or even applied math, in fact, right? Mathematics operates according to an inherent logic, right, of its own. And the question of whether or not are we making authentic discoveries or is this just sort of a tool that we're playing around with? That's a deep philosophical question within mathematics. But that's interesting because it's like, wait a minute, science is beholden to math, but math is not beholden to science, right? Science needs math in order to make sense of the observable world, let's say, but not the other way around. And philosophy helped me to think, wow, this relationship and seeing there already a particular limitation. Now, that doesn't mean that scientific discoveries cannot generate new mathematical insights. Sometimes that does happen, right? Or certain questions in math that hitherto would not have been asked that are now being asked because of the advent of certain fields within quantum physics or something like that, right? So those are some of the things there. I realized I was approaching science with a kind of totalizing system sense. And really, philosophy was only a place where I can kind of expand my wings. There was also a spiritual journey that I was undergoing as well in my undergraduate career that had a deep motivating factor behind a bit of the shift as well. But yeah.
I'm excited to ask both of you guys this question because of your history in the sciences. How can someone post-academia, right, day-to-day life does not have a direct interaction with the sciences, like on a professional or academic level, but how can we integrate some of the insights or some of the big takeaways that science can provide? How can we integrate that into our everyday life as we try to live the good life? You know, like as we think about philosophy, as we look at what philosophy is trying to answer, how can we integrate the sciences, even if we don't have that direct connection that you guys had in academia? Do you guys have any insight or anything along those lines?
The one that I'm most excited about is how science plays a role in helping our day-to-day lives and our careers, to be honest. Because remember, we spoke about science as a discipline, as a way of understanding. In education, for example, I and several of my colleagues played a huge role in helping educators understand how to use the scientific method to improve the process of educating.
Wow.
Because one of the problems that we currently have in education is that when we've learned something, whether it's as an individual or organization, it disappears, right? It's no longer utilized. And then the experiment runs again, right? And it just becomes this perpetual relearning of the same thing. And what makes it very different from other discipline in that what makes a great teacher is rediscovered again. And in a lot of cases, if you're lucky enough, you become an apprentice, right? So the apprentice model is very helpful in education. This is pre-science, right? In the way we do our work. Where we leaned into was, as hundreds of teachers were going through this process, we collected the information through learning that gave us a better understanding of what made a great teacher, or what makes how to understand the educational process. And we wrote it down, and we went through the experiment, and we refined it. And all of that was traditional trial and error. There's a methodology in business called Six Sigma. Probably is not a surprise to anyone that came out of a group of scientists in the military, and it transferred to business and so on. So it's a way of understanding processes. And I was talking about replication and being able to do that, which is something that's very, very important in almost any endeavor that you have, right? If you've done something and you're like, wow, this worked, you kind of want to figure out why,
Right.
right? So that you're able to repeat it again. And then in our own personal lives, it's the same, right? And personally, I've had this journey of self-exploration and understanding that has been very scientific, right? There are things that I've done, whether it's psychological or through my relationships, that I said, well, that didn't work, right? And very scientific about like, all right, let me tweak this. That seems to work. Why did it work? And so on. We can have a conversation about the science of psychology, but it's actually opened up the field of psychology to me quite a bit from that perspective.
Wow.
Yeah, for me, I would approach the question by thinking of it in the following sense. What findings does science give us that could, in fact, generate a sense of deep awe and curiosity about the world that we live in? So I would encourage folks to open up a scientific book, go and explore some of those scientific YouTube channels that, they go into some of the processes of whatever aspect of empirical reality, and allow yourself to be washed by some of these discoveries so that a sense of awe and wonder can be sparked in your own heart. Think about the implications of what is being discovered in science. Think about what this means for you in your life in a general sense. I think these are some good ways forward as we think about the practical implication of science for everyday life. If we're talking about living a meaningful life, a wise life, part of what that means, I take it to be, is this, that we should be open to the truth wherever we find it. And science is indeed giving us a tremendous amount of awareness, truths concerning a certain aspect of reality. So we grow with that, we grow with that. Don't approach science just as a means to an end. That has its place, but allow it to be a source of innovation, a source of wonder, a source of self-exploration. Even for a person, let's say like you, Louis, in the arts, you can think about how certain scientific discoveries could perhaps generate new creativity in you. And there are artists who have done this, who have looked towards certain aspects of the empirical world and to sort of take that as a kind of paradigm for their artistic approach. I think of, what's his name? Gaudi, the one who in Spain, am I saying his name right? Gaudi, that church that's still being built,
I'm not sure.
kind of like organic and melting form, like a dreamlike form.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think he's motivated by certain things in biology, right? So these are some fascinating ways forward.
Using the sciences to kind of enrich
That's a good
the
word.
thing, the particular subjects that you pursue.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like since science is always at the cusp of innovation, and then sometimes there's this gray area, how can we kind of like sit in that space where like science isn't really providing an answer? Like sometimes I'll be in that space of like, there's an anxiety at the unknown. As an example, we talked about it before. Is it the James Webb telescope? Some of the new imagery that's coming back from that is kind of reshaping how we look at the stars and the galaxies, and even there's talks about the age of the universe, like that number changing. And these discoveries, sometimes I feel like they can produce an unpleasant feeling or implication because it changes what we know, right, about the world today. Is there any type of either like encouragement or questions that we should ask ourselves when we're in the middle of like science and a new discovery, whether it's in the form of a headline or personal discovery? How can we sit with that tension as we pursue science in our lives?
The first thing is that it's an unnecessary tension, because an understanding of science means that we will constantly be discovering. Joe and I we used to talk quite a bit about the intersections of classical physics versus quantum versus and so on. And all of that proves out to us some level of approximation that science provides us, or the sciences. That's what I keep saying, the current sciences, right? I think to be able to sit with that ambiguity of we actually do not know, we truly do not know the truth. Joe is better equipped to speak about what truth really means, right? But science does not tell us that things are 100% the way it is saying that it is, right? We know historically that everything has become an approximation. So that's the first thing. But there's some beauty in that. And I guess you have to be a certain type of person. I don't know, but let me see how you sit with this. Knowing that time as we experience it is not natural, which means all things have happened, right? And sitting with that gives someone like myself, who have grown up with fear of death, a little bit of comfort around the fact that we don't know everything, right? It's like being on a roller coaster, right? And you could see over that you're about to fall, and you can be terrified, but it could also be exhilarating, right? Because you don't quite know how you'll react or how it will go. And I would say embrace that, right? There's just something beautiful about that fact that I think is worth every human being latching onto.
Yeah, try to enjoy the ride, transform the anxiety into easier said than done, of course, I know, but to transform the anxiety into an opportunity to explore something and to be open to that exploration. That's what makes science so sexy, so attractive, so fun. It's that exploratory element in it. And you'll hear this often by scientists, right? When new discoveries are made, they themselves experience a kind of a tension between the anxiety of a loss of a particular paradigm that they cherished, but the new excitement of, wow, new physics and new cosmologies are about to unfold. So you see that even that tension there, even in the lives of many scientists. So you're not alone in that, and they're in the field. I would say allow it to be a humbling experience. Because what we tend to do is we make idols out of our understanding. We say, oh, science is telling us this. We then internally set it up as a kind of idol that we are beholden to. And when that idol is threatened, it's like your God is threatened and is about to tumble, right? And that should tell us something, that why do I default to this kind of attachment, right? Why do I put the eggs in this particular basket in such a way? That is to say, this is an opportunity for self-exploration, to go deeper, right? On two accounts. Number one, why does new scientific discoveries have such an effect on me? What premium am I putting on science? Number two, why? Why is this happening? Why do I think now that, oh man, the universe may not be 13.2 billion or 13.7 billion years old? It may be 25 billion years old, because we're finding out galaxies or whatever the case, or the universe may be eternal. Mm-hmm. Right? Why is that generating a kind of anxiety in me? So just asking, right, turning the questions to the self, asking ourselves what's happening, that's fodder for deeper insight through introspection.
Can I elaborate on what you just said, Joe?
Yeah.
With what you just said, I would say that this is an invitation to metaphysics, metascience, theology, and so on, right? To Joe's point, the fact that science has little to say about a lot of big things should feel like an invitation. And it shouldn't be that, and this was a mistake many young scientists have made in the past, science should not, diving into metaphysics, metascience, and so on, theology, should not be seen as unscientific. By definition, science has very little to say about exploring those disciplines, which is why Joe relates a lot to the philosophy of things, right? And as you start to think about these things, as you start to feel that unease, it's a tug or another invitation into maybe philosophy and some of those other disciplines.
Well said.
Joe and Edwin, thank you so much for this conversation. I think you've certainly changed the way I looked at science from, I just saw it as like an old subject and the occasional news article, but it is something that I think should be integrated into our lives and how we understand the world. So I look forward to having more conversations like this with you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Louis.